when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all his holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer to them, Assuredly I say, insomuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. Then he will say to those on the left hand, Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not take me in. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto you? Then he will answer them, saying, Assuredly I say to you, insomuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it unto me. And these will go into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Now, on one hand, these verses, the parable of the sheep and the goats, that could be rather terrifying. It could have a person wondering whom they neglected to show compassion to. But on the other hand, I think it illuminates what's at the heart of the gospel message. If you purport to be a Christian or somebody that follows Christ, and that faith doesn't inspire you to become a more compassionate person and a more forgiving person, then one might suspect that you missed the plot. Sometimes in religion, and maybe in anything else, I suppose, would-be adherents get obsessed over finer details. They argue and debate them ad nauseum. And sometimes those debates need to be had, but one ought to be careful not to let them distract you from the main plot point. In Matthew 23:23, Jesus says to the Pharisees, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faith. These you ought to have done, without leaving the others undone. So he's basically saying to the Pharisees, you're really good at offering up these herbs and spices as burnt offerings, but you neglected things like justice and mercy. In the next verse, he says, Blind guides who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, i.e., they obsess over small things and don't notice the really obvious big things. So to belabor my point here, I'm going to reference the story of the Good Samaritan. So for reference, Jesus was born to Jewish parents. His disciples were Jewish. His ministry took place among the Jewish people. And the catalyst for this story was a scribe, a teacher of the Jewish law. Comes up to him and asks him, What must I do to obtain eternal life? And Jesus responds with, Well, what is written in the law? And the scribe responds with the great commandment, Love God with all your heart, strength, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus replies, yeah, that's pretty good. Go and do that. But the scripture says that the scribe, looking to justify himself, asks Jesus, Who is my neighbor? And that prompts Jesus to tell the story of the Good Samaritan. And the story is basically thus. There's a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. And as he's traveling, thieves fall upon him. They beat him up, rob him, leave him for dead on the side of the road. And as he's laying there, a priest comes by, and the priest sees him, but he just keeps going. Evidently he was late for a meeting or something. And then a little while later, Levite comes by, and same thing. He sees him, but just keeps going. Now, both of these men should have known better. Obviously, the priest and the Levite were important figures in the religious tradition, and they should have known better. They both should have had great knowledge of the scriptures, and probably should have known as much than to have passion on this man. And lastly, a Samaritan comes by, and the Samaritan has compassion on him, dresses his wounds, takes him to an inn, and pays for his stay in this inn. So the Samaritan takes care of this guy and ministers onto him. And after Jesus tells this story, he asks the scribe, of these three men, who was the neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? And the scribe responds, the one who ministered onto him. Jesus tells him, well, go and do likewise. Now, the story makes sense on its face, but if you know the context, it even cuts a little deeper. He was telling this to a Jewish audience. The scribe was obviously Jewish. And in the first century, the Jews and the Samaritans weren't the best of friends. The Jews obviously had their tradition, and the Samaritans claimed to be descendants of Abraham as well, but their tradition had sort of evolved separately because they were separated from the rest of the tribes when they were during the captivities. Not an expert on the history of the Samaritans, but something to that effect. And their traditions didn't quite mesh, so there was tension between these two groups. For an analogy from the Christian world, think of like Catholics and Protestants. At best, they don't quite agree on doctrine. At worst, they see each other as heretics. That's sort of the dynamic that existed between the Samaritans and the Jews. A modern telling of the story might be the good Palestinian. And I don't mean to pick on the Jews, because you could reverse the story too. If you were talking to an audience of Palestinians, I suppose you could tell the story about the good Jew. In the Christian tradition, you could go to Catholics and tell them the story about the good Protestant, or vice versa. In today's political climate, you could go to a bunch of hard-nosed Democrats and tell them the story of the good conservative, the good MAGA Trump supporter. Or you could go to a group of conservatives and tell them about the good woke liberal. But I think the point is, he's taking someone that the audience is going to see with suspicion, even contempt maybe, because of their views, their doctrines. And he's saying, look, perhaps they don't perfectly have their doctrines in a row, and perhaps their doctrines might even be in error. But they at least have enough sense to show compassion onto their fellow human beings. And perhaps, if you find that you lack such compassion, perhaps they're even closer than God than you, despite the fact that they might be technically wrong on such and such a doctrine. And perhaps they even are wrong on that doctrine, but they're right about something that's fundamentally more important. Now, when I was a late teen, early 20s, when I was reading the Bible for myself, I was pretty good at questioning and picking apart doctrines, various religious traditions. I'd read the Bible, and I'd look out into the world and compare it to what I was reading. And for example, I was very critical of among other things, Catholicism. I don't believe in the infallibility of the Pope, because there's no scriptural basis for it. And then if you look at history, obviously there's been popes that are reprobates and corrupt. Not to say they're all like that. There's been some decent ones too, but clearly they're fallible. There was also sort of a myth among some Catholics that their particular brand of Christendom is like the one true brand, which isn't the case either. For example, the book of Revelation, there's 7 churches mentioned, none of which are the Church of Rome. In the Catholic tradition, priests are required to be celibate. Now, if a man chooses to stay celibate and devote his life entirely to his role in the church, I don't have a problem with that, but it's not a requirement. in the biblical narrative in the New Testament. In fact, the scriptures merely require the man to be a sober man and one in good standing in his community and the husband of no more than one wife. So there's lots of extra biblical stuff in the Catholic tradition. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of well-intentioned, compassionate people that ascribe to that tradition. I could make similar jabs at the Mormon tradition. To the extent that they follow the New Testament, more power to them. But I don't believe the Book of Mormon is divinely inspired. The Mormon Church has evolved and reformed some of its earlier teachings, but some of its earlier teachings on race, for example, were just abhorrent. All that said, that doesn't mean that there's not well-intentioned, compassionate people in the Mormon tradition. In fact, I suspect if I lived in a community full of Mormons, the crime rate would be near zero, and everybody would be super nice and neighborly. Or at least they have a reputation for being a very family-orientated group. They seem to do a good job of raising their children to be model citizens. And to be honest, I really don't mind the missionaries either. Now, some people don't like religious people knocking on their door. Mind you, if they're bringing extra biblical doctrines to me, I'm not likely to buy what they're selling. However, there's a certain admiration I have for the courage it takes to go door to door and knock on the doors of strangers and share with them their convictions. And perhaps their doctrine is pretty whacked up and some of their teachings are demonstrably false. A man that exhibits courage, even whilst laboring under a delusion, nonetheless is still displaying courage. Now, if I wanted to offend everybody under the sun and nitpick the false doctrine and all the different traditions, I could make this video very, very long, but the point is, well, doctrine is important, and you want to expose and root out false teachings. You should also look for the good in people and not lose sight of their humanity. I'm sure that the Good Samaritan in this story didn't have a perfect knowledge of all the finer points of the Jewish tradition, but he knew enough to show compassion to a stranger in need, which might suggest that he was closer to God than the priest and the Levite in the story. So with that, let's circle back to our parable of the sheep and the goat. If you live in America like I do, it's a nation of roughly 350 million people. And in fact, you live in a world of roughly 8 billion people. There's no shortage of poor or sick people to minister onto. Now, I used to think that America, being one of the richest economy in the world, poverty in America is a little different. It's not comparable to, say, the abject poverty in, say, the Horn of Africa or something, where people are living in mud huts. Even our poor people have a roof over their heads, have electricity, running water, usually, often even a car or a color TV. Not to mention the obesity rate in America. Oftentimes, our poor and working class people are overweight. In fact, I think it might even be the case that lower classes have a higher obesity rate than the more affluent people. So a lot of them are not exactly starving. But then I thought, there are still kids that go hungry in America, even if it's just through neglect. Maybe they go hungry not because there isn't food to be had, but their parents are incompetent and too busy, drinking and getting high or partying or whatever, that they neglect to feed their children. And in any event, whatever the reason, the end result is still a hungry kid. But even if the U.S. is the largest economy in the world, if you drive around enough, you're still going to run into some neighborhoods that are clearly downtrodden. The root causes might be different, but trying to understand those causes and if possible, ministering to them and trying to alleviate those problems is still a noble endeavor. There's no shortage of poor people to try to understand and minister to. And maybe one's thinking, well, I'm fairly poor myself. I really don't have a ton extra to start feeding and clothing the impoverished masses with. And that very well might be true in many cases. But what does it cost to show kindness to a stranger? Maybe find an outcast. Maybe befriend somebody that doesn't appear to have many friends. And I can even relate to those people. As an awkward, introverted kid with my own peculiar interest, making friends and fitting in wasn't always my expertise. And maybe because I was that way, I was sort of a target for bullies. At least I remember being bullied here and there in grade school. And one might have mixed feelings about that. Maybe it's actually good for a kid to get pushed around a little bit because it teaches him to eventually stick up for himself. And in my case, maybe I got bullied on the bus ride to and from school or on the playground here and there, but at least I had a fairly decent home life, so I could come home to that. And when I was growing up, the internet was only just beginning to take off. Social media wasn't really a thing, so I didn't have to worry about getting bullied online like some kids do today. But imagine being the kid that's bullied relentlessly in school, has to come home to a dysfunctional family life where doesn't get much support there, and then if he tries to go online, well, he gets bullied there as well. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why suicide among young people is so high. And I have heard from people that study such things that often lack of connection is a root cause in addiction. People turn to substance abuse as a coping mechanism to mask their lack of connection with the society around them. In any event, showing a little kindness to people that are struggling very well might prevent a tragedy. Whatever your burden happens to be, there's no shortage of people that need ministering to. So find your niche if you're so inclined.
You've been watching the Flutch Report. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the end of the video. But before you click onto the next thing and continue down whatever rabbit hole you're on YouTube or Rumble, I've got a small favor to ask. If you found value in my content and you want to help the channel out, the best thing you can do is share it with somebody else that you think will find value in it. Don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe if you want to see more. Links to the channel on YouTube and Rumble will be provided below. Additionally, I'm making a Facebook page for the channel as well as a X/formerly Twitter. Feel free to follow me on those platforms as well. If you're feeling exceptionally generous, provided in the description below will be a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is the online equivalent of a tip jar. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.